Hashem ki Hashem Agam alaychi Ki chilakta nafshi v'imoves eseini min dima hayes ragli aymi
Very pretty song from Eitan Katz, Shuvi Nafshi from his album Unplugged. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Sunday night? I'm going to say it's going to be a spicy Sunday night. We'll get to that in a minute. Yehud in Florence, South Carolina. Tom in PA. Nancy in North Carolina. John in Maine. John in Sedona. Patrice in Utah. Guy in Ohio. I'm not sure what that is all about. Belle in North Texas. Ryan in Minneapolis. Bella in Florida. Karen in Northern California. Melissa in Great Neck. Leslie in Minneapolis. Stephen in Hawaii. James in Indianapolis. Paula in Chicago. Lucy in Minnesota. Welcome everybody over there on the YouTube side, still awaiting. Great to be with you on a Sunday night. Turn that off over here. Tonight we are going to be covering page 34 here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 3, and we are studying all these various specific incidents and examples of how we would apply the laws of levirate marriage, Yibum, which we learned in the first two chapters, the nuances that we learned by applying them to different situations, and often somewhat extreme, probably hypothetical situations, just so that we understand the law better. And of course, it's a form of divine service to get deep into the law and try to understand what God's will would be for us, even in these extreme situations, which are unlikely to come up in real life. Tonight we have such a case where there's two brothers betrothed to two sisters, and somehow the brides and grooms get mixed up at the weddings and celebrate their wedding night not with the intended marriage partner, and what is going to be the outcome of that. And it's actually been a continuation of the discussion we've had in the last Mishna, which explored the question of whether two prohibitions or more can take hold simultaneously, or can you only really violate one prohibition at a time? Now, pursuant to that discussion, tonight we're going to get into a discussion that I must say, I would not choose to lecture on. Okay, so if I wasn't teaching a Daf Yomi Shir, a Daf Yomi class, where we're going to read every page of the Talmud together, and learn together what is the wisdom of our sages contained in each page. If I was just going to pick a page here or there to teach, so I wouldn't teach this page, because we're going to get into some delicate matters of marital relations and what kinds of marital practices are permitted or are prohibited. Of course, there's going to be various opinions on this, and we're not in any way meant to make tonight's class a class in marital relations and what is permitted or prohibited. We're really just touching on this subject pursuant to our more wide-ranging discussion of what happens when a man dies childless and he has a surviving brother and a widow. And they have an obligation to marry that's going to or perform chalitza, which is going to override the normal prohibition against a man ever being with his brother's wife. But pursuant to this discussion, it's going to come up whether certain kinds of acts in the bedroom are permitted or prohibited, and how we learn out from the story in Genesis of Tamar being married first to Er and then Onan, the sons of Judah. And then what exactly onanism is, wasting seed. It's a huge avera, a big sin, a big prohibition on a Jewish man wasting his seed. But how does that intersect with the other obligation that a Jewish husband has of making his wife happy, including physically happy? So we're going to touch on these subjects, stuff that we wouldn't normally talk about, and we're going to act like adults as we talk about it. And we're going to basically just learn what the law says. We're not going to be doing a deep dive on these subjects. And this is definitely one of those areas where the law ends up being somewhat unclear about certain specific things. And if you have a question in these matters, you really need to discuss it with your rabbi, or at least do your own research. You cannot rely on our class tonight to tell you what is kosher in the bedroom or what is not. It's a big subject that needs deeper study than we'll be able to provide tonight. Having said that, let's dive in. So we're picking this up at the bottom of 33b. With Mishna number 11 here in chapter 3. The initial case that we're studying is very colorful, and interesting. So in the case of two men who betrothed two women, and at the time that they entered the wedding canopy, the chuppah, after they were betrothed, the men switched this wife with that wife and that one with this one. Then these two men are liable for engaging in forbidden sexual relations with a married woman. I mean, this stands to reason before we even go any further. You betrothed a woman. Now, right, in Judaism, as we've learned a bunch of times, this act of betrothal, maybe a little bit analogous to getting engaged in our modern secular culture, but it's not the same, because you get engaged in this culture and then you decide to call off the wedding. Maybe you give the ring back, maybe you don't, but that's it. People are free to go their separate ways. In Judaism, if you become betrothed, at that moment, you become the couple becomes prohibited to everyone else in the world. And if they decide to call off the wedding, they need a divorce. They need to the husband needs to give the wife, right, because she is his wife, even though they haven't consummated the union, she is considered his wife for many halachic matters, and he must give a kosher bill of divorce so that she becomes permitted to go her separate way and marry some other man. And likewise, so he can go, since we don't have bigamy anymore for 1,000 years, for him to become free to marry another woman, he also has to go through that divorce as a result of this betrothal. Now, so they were betrothed, two men betrothed to women, and then somehow, and they're going to discuss whether it was intentional or accidental, the brides became switched. And then they went under the chuppah and had a marriage. They had a wedding to the wrong woman. How did this happen? We don't know. But the point is it happened, and we'll discuss more about that. But it happened. And so what happened was you went through an invalid wedding. Since you were betrothed to a different woman, this wedding ceremony was meaningless. It didn't take hold. And then they consummated the union with the wrong woman. So at that point, each man had sex with a woman who was the wife of a different man. So that is adultery. If they did it on purpose, it's a massive sin with huge problems. But even accidentally, now they become liable to bring the sin offering, which is the way to make an atonement for an unintended sin of this kind, right? So the kind of sin that if you did it intentionally would result in charis, excision by the heavenly court. If you did it unwittingly, so then you would bring a sin offering when the temple is standing. When the temple is not standing, you pray to God for forgiveness and go through other steps of atonement, but you can't bring that offering. Okay, so the two men were betrothed to two different women. The women were switched. They went under the wedding canopy, and then they had sexual relations. Therefore, these two men are liable for engaging in forbidden sexual relations with a married woman, since each of them had intercourse with his fellow's wife. The act of betrothal is sufficient to prohibit a woman to all other men because she is now a married woman. Therefore, when the women were switched, both men transgressed this violation of sleeping with a married woman who's not married to you. And if the two men were brothers, then they are also liable for a second transgression that simultaneous at the same time. One, they slept with a married woman. Two, if the men are brothers, they slept with his brothers. Each man slept with his brother's wife. So they're liable for two transgression. If the two women were also sisters, then now they're liable for three transgressions. They become liable for taking a wife and her sister as well. And if the woman happened to be menstruating at the time, then they would liable for having intercourse with a menstruating woman who is his wife's sister and is his brother's wife and is a married woman. With that same act of having intercourse, they become liable for committing 4 transgressions and liable to bring 4 sin offerings if the temple were standing. And following these forbidden sexual relations, what do we do as a rabbinic court? What do we do about it? They come to us and they say, okay, we didn't do this on purpose. This is what happened. What should we do now? We, the court, separate these women from their husbands for 3 months. Can you guess why? Why 3 months? To make sure that if the woman became pregnant that night, that we know that the pregnancy resulted from this prohibited marital union, as opposed to if they went back to their husbands the next night and started having sex, which is permitted with their husbands, but they started doing it right away. If they became pregnant within those 3 months, we wouldn't know who the father was, right? So we have to establish, and that's why they're going to be prohibited to their husbands for 3 months, and God willing, nobody became pregnant with that prohibited sexual union after the bride switching, the accidental bride switching that happened on the wedding night. Because if, God forbid, this woman betrothed to a different man gets pregnant with this man, essentially accidentally, since they didn't know that they were prohibited to each other when they did it, if she becomes pregnant, then what you have is a woman, a Jewish woman, getting pregnant by a Jewish man outside of marriage, and the child is a mamzer. Very, very tragic situation, because a mamzer is not permitted to marry within the Jewish community except another mamzer. So we separate the women from their husbands for 3 months, lest they were impregnated by that forbidden act of intercourse. Doing so makes it possible to distinguish a child born of these relations so that he could be rendered a mamzer. And if the women were female minors who are unable to bear children, then we immediately return them to their original husbands, because there's no fear, there's no concern that they became pregnant that night. And if these women were the daughters of priests, well, they are thereby disqualified from eating teruma, right? A woman, the household, the family of a priest can eat teruma, even though the other family members are not themselves priests, the daughters, the wife, etc. Only a priest, a Kohen, can eat teruma, consecrated food set aside for priests to eat, but so can their households. In fact, even a slave in the household of a priest is permitted to eat teruma. But a girl, a daughter of a priest who commits adultery, is disqualified from eating teruma, even by accident. By engaging in illicit sexual acts, they are rendered forbidden to priests and disqualified from eating teruma. That's Mishnah number 11. Gemara. In the Mishnah, it states, they switched this one with that one. Are we dealing with wicked individuals? That they would intentionally switch their wives? The Gemara asks in shock. Furthermore, consider that which Rabbi Chia taught on the subject. There are 16 sin offerings here, right? If indeed it was 2 brothers betrothed to 2 sisters, and then they were switched, and the women happened to be menstruating, So then 4 people would each have to bring 4 sin offerings for all of the related sins that were committed here. So 16 sin offerings would have to be brought. According to Rabbi Chia, there are 16 sin offerings here, 4 sin offerings for each of the men and 4 for each of the women. Yet, if they had acted intentionally, would there be even 1 sin offering? You don't bring a sin offering for a sin that you committed intentionally. You can make an atonement for that, but a sin offering, when the temple is standing, is not the avenue for that atonement. So sacrifices are brought only for unintentional acts. And Rav Yehuda said, teach instead that they were switched, which indicates that the switching was not done intentionally. Rather, the women were accidentally mixed up. That is the case that leads to the analysis that we need to conduct here and whether multiple prohibitions can take hold at the same time. If they did it intentionally, it's a different analysis and it's actually a simpler and less challenging one, and that is not what the sages are analyzing here. So the Gemara comments, this too stands to reason from the fact that the second clause of the Mishnah teaches if they were female minors and unable to bear children, then we immediately return them. If they had switched the wives intentionally, would it be permitted to return a woman who had engaged in illicit sexual acts intentionally to her husband? Do we return a woman who intentionally cheated on her husband to her husband? No, we don't, according to halacha. So the Gemara comments, this is not difficult and does not disprove the notion that the act was intentional. Even if the act was intentional, these women would be permitted to return to their husbands. This is because this would only be in the case of the minor girl, because the seduction of a minor is rape. So if a woman is raped, yes, she can return to her husband. It's not her fault that she was raped. But if she intentionally engaged in adultery, then no, she's not permitted to return to her husband under Jewish law. If she's a minor, it doesn't matter what her volition was. It's considered rape when you have sex with a minor. However, this can be derived from a different point that the Mishnah teaches, that we know it's going to be an unintentional switching. We separate these women from their husbands for 3 months, as perhaps they became pregnant. From here, it can be deduced, were it to become clear after 3 months that they are not pregnant, they are permitted to return to their husbands. And if they had acted intentionally, would this be permitted? Right, so now we know we're not talking about minors, we're talking about adult women. We're returning them to their husbands. So if they had cheated intentionally, we wouldn't do that. So from this, we understand that this was an unintentional switching. And the Gemara conclude from here that this is the case. It was an accidental switching. Okay, now we're at the top of 34a. The Gemara asks, according to Rabbi Chia, who teaches that this case incurs 16 different sin offerings because 4 prohibitions were violated by each of 4 people. 16 sin offerings. So according to Rabbi Chia, who holds that there are 16 sin offerings, who is this Tana, this rabbi of the Mishnah, who holds that a prohibition takes effect where another prohibition already exists, and specifically in the case of a more inclusive prohibition, and in the case of an expanded prohibition, and in the case of a simultaneous prohibition. Yesterday, we were distinguishing how when 2 prohibitions can take hold simultaneously, there's different expressions of that. Whether the 2 prohibitions that were violated, came on the person who violated them at the same time, or maybe they were already prohibited in one department, and then there was a change in circumstances that added a second prohibition later, which was a different case than when the 2 prohibitions took hold simultaneously. There was also the different case where we say, 2 prohibitions can be violated at the same time if the second prohibition that was added to the situation actually added more people to be prohibited, and so has a different nature to it than the original prohibition, which applies to fewer people. And that would be a different outcome, Jewish legally speaking, than if the additional prohibition only affected the same number of people. But here, the 4 different prohibitions that are being violated are each of a somewhat different nature. Some take hold simultaneously, some add more people in what is prohibited. and some are more, expanded versus inclusive, etc. We have all the different kinds of prohibitions happening at the same time. So who is the Tana who would prohibit all of these at the same time? In other words, would say that 4 prohibitions have been violated despite all these different variations of how much extra law was broken when the act was performed. And to sort of quickly summarize that question, if these men are brothers, the moment that one betrothed a woman, that woman was immediately rendered forbidden to the second brother, both as a married woman and as his brother's wife. So that action of betrothal added 2 prohibitions between the other brother and this woman at the same time. Those were simultaneous prohibitions. When the second brother then betrothed her sister, now an extra prohibition was added. You can't be with your wife's sister. That wasn't effective until the second brother betrothed the second sister. This is a more inclusive prohibition because as a result of this betrothal, the second brother is prohibited from engaging in sexual intercourse, not only with his wife's sister, who is his brother's wife, but also with all of her other sisters who don't happen to be married to his brother. When this woman becomes a menstruating woman, she is forbidden to her husband as well. Right? When a menstruating woman can't sleep with any man, including her husband. So that's one more person added to the list of prohibited people. Consequently, the Mishnah includes examples of all 3 types of prohibitions, inclusive, expanded, and simultaneous. And they all take effect in this case. Therefore, the Gemara is asking, who is the rabbi, who is the Tana who holds that in each of these cases, the prohibition takes effect even where another prohibition already exists? And Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said, this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. As it is taught in a baraisa, there is one who performs a single act of eating an olive bulk, a little olive volume of food, and he becomes liable to bring 4 sin offerings and 1 guilt offerings. He ate one little piece of food, and at that moment he became liable to bring 4 sin offerings and a guilt offering. 5 offerings because he ate one little olive-sized piece of food. What is the case? How so? This halacha, this law applies to one who is ritually impure. He is tameh, so he's not permitted to eat consecrated foods, who ate forbidden fat. That's a piece of an offering that one is not allowed to eat. That piece of food that came from an offering, right? It was consecrated food, but there's a part of the consecrated food that one is not allowed to eat, the forbidden fats. That fat was also nasar, meaning that it came from a consecrated offering which needed to be eaten within a certain time period, like a day and a night or a day and 2 nights, whatever it is. And then after that time limit expired, it becomes nasar. It must be burned in its entirety and not eaten. But this person ate it after its time passed. It was forbidden fat. It came from a consecrated food which he ate while he was ritually impure. And he did it on Yom Kippur, right, when he's supposed to be fasting and not eating anything at all. One who did this is liable to bring 1 sin offering for eating consecrated food while impure, 1 sin offering for eating forbidden fat, 1 sin offering for eating nasar after its time, and 1 for eating on Yom Kippur. And he is also liable to bring a guilt offering for misuse of consecrated items. It is consecrated and he abused the consecration by using it for his own benefit when he ate it. In this case, it was prohibited to eat the fat from the moment the animal was born. When the animal was consecrated, the prohibition against deriving benefit from it took effect on the entire animal, rendering this an expanded prohibition. When the priest became ritually impure and thereby prohibited from partaking of all sanctified foods, a more inclusive prohibition took effect. The moment that the fat was rendered nasar, it became prohibited to offer it on the altar as well, so that it is another instance of an expanded prohibition. And lastly, on Yom Kippur, an additional, more inclusive prohibition took effect because on Yom Kippur, it is prohibited to eat all food, even that which is not consecrated. So Rabbi Meir says, there is one more sin offering for which he may be liable if it was Shabbos, and he carried this olive bulk of food from one domain to another while it was in his mouth, then he is liable for carrying on Shabbos. The rabbi said to Rabbi Meir, liability for the sin offering that you added is not incurred from violation of the same type of prohibition. He is liable for carrying out the food, not for eating it. In this example, the prohibitions of Shabbos and Yom Kippur took effect at the same moment, and therefore this last case would be an instance of simultaneous prohibitions, and Rabbi Meir holds that they take effect as well. The sages disagree with him, but Rabbi Meir says simultaneous prohibitions take effect. Therefore, this Baraisa demonstrates that Rabbi Meir is the Tana who holds that prohibitions take effect where other prohibitions already exist, even in all these instances where you could become liable to 4, 5, or even 6 offerings through the same action. So the Gemara continues to clarify the opinion of Rabbi Meir. And in accordance with whose opinion is this statement of Rabbi Meir? If you say that it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, well, then this is difficult. Because didn't Rabbi Yehoshua say that one who made a mistake while performing a mitzvah is exempt from bringing a sin offering? I.e., one who unwittingly performed a transgression while intending to perform a mitzvah is exempt from punishment, according to Rabbi Yehoshua. So in the case, in our Mishnah, the men intended to perform the mitzvah of marriage. They were trying to do something holy. They didn't know they were marrying the wrong woman. They were doing one of the holiest things that a man can do. Get married. An incredibly beautiful mitzvah. Sets up the mitzvah of procreation. But the getting married itself is a mitzvah. But they unwittingly violated a transgression because the wives were switched. Therefore, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, they should be exempt from any sin offering, since they were involved in performing a mitzvah. They thought they were performing a mitzvah. They made a mistake. But according to Rabbi Yehoshua, if you're intending to perform a mitzvah and by mistake you perform a sin, you don't bring a sin offering. Therefore, this Mishnah, our Mishnah, is being taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that even if one mistakenly transgressed while attempting to perform a mitzvah, he is still obligated to bring a sin offering. If you wish, you can resolve this differently. You could say, actually, this can be explained even according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, right? Why would Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that you don't become liable to bring a sin offering if you made a sin unwittingly while trying to perform a mitzvah, not just doing something permitted, but something that you're obligated to do, a mitzvah? How could it be that even according to Rabbi Yehoshua, they're liable to bring the sin offerings? When Rabbi Yehoshua says that one who erred with regard to a mitzvah is exempt, this applies only to the case of babies who were mixed up in such a way that on Shabbos, the moil, right, the rabbi usually, or at least a doctor, trained and certified to perform a circumcision, did it to the wrong baby. In other words, there were 2 babies that stood to be circumcised. For one of the babies, its 8th day fell on Shabbos. And for the other baby, its 8th day fell either the day before or the day after Shabbos. And they mixed up the babies. We saw this case when we were, I think, in Tractate Erevin. And so by mistake, they circumcised the wrong baby on Shabbos. Now, you do circumcise on Shabbos, even though normally drawing blood is one of the prohibited labors that you may not do on Shabbos, and the procedure necessarily will draw blood. You override that prohibition because a circumcision in its time on the 8th day that falls on Shabbos overrides the prohibition of doing labor on Shabbos. But if you did it with the wrong baby by mistake, so then that was breaking Shabbos in vain. There was no reason, right? You didn't have the justification of doing a circumcision in its time on the 8th day. That baby wasn't its 8th day. You circumcise it by mistake, so then you'll be liable to bring a sin offering for violating Shabbos. But Rabbi Eliezer says the moil is not, he doesn't have to bring a sin offering. The mistake was made pursuant to doing a mitzvah. And as they're going to say, he was pressed for time. That's an additional condition where you're going to get, off without the sin offering. This applies only to the case of babies who are mixed up in such a way that on Shabbos the moil mistakenly circumcised a baby whose time had not yet come for circumcision. Since the moil did not fulfill the mitzvah of circumcision, he should be liable for performing prohibited labor on Shabbos. However, Rabbi Yehoshua exempts him from a sin offering since he is pressed for time. Because the circumcision must be performed only on the day specified, he was rushed, he was anxious to perform the circumcision, and due to the sense of urgency, he made a mistake and thought that the proper time was on Shabbos. In this case of our Mishnah, however, where the mistake involved marriage, since the brothers were not pressed for time, right? There was no 8th day on which you need to do a circumcision. There's no day on which you must do a marriage. They just scheduled the wedding. You could say there's a lot of people who feel pressed for time on a wedding day, but it doesn't have that same halachic ramification of making sure that the circumcision happens on the 8th day. The wedding could be performed on any day. And therefore, there was not this being pressed for time element. Therefore, Rabbi Yehoshua would not deem these brothers exempt. They need to bring the sin offering. The Gemara objects. And yet, in the case of eating teruma, where one is not pressed for time, and nevertheless Rabbi Yehoshua exempts him if the act involved a mitzvah, as we learned in a Mishnah on Tractate Pesachim, page 72, if a priest was partaking of teruma, that is food consecrated that only priests can eat, and it became known that he was the son of a divorced woman, or the son of a chalutza, and thereby he's disqualified from the priesthood. A chalutza is a woman who's had chalitza, and thereby disqualified from the priesthood and prohibited from eating teruma. So Rabbi Eliezer deems him liable to pay the value of the principal and an additional fifth, like any priest who unwittingly ate teruma and thereby made personal use of consecrated property. The penalty for that is you return what you ate plus a fifth. However, Rabbi Yehoshua exempts him because at the time of consumption, he intended to perform a mitzvah, for he thought that he was a priest eating teruma. And the Gemara responds, but wasn't it stated with regard to that Mishnah that Rav Bevai bar Abaye said, here we are dealing with leavened teruma that was being eaten by the priest on the eve of Passover, because in that situation he is pressed for time. But in this case, he would rush to eat. In that case, he would rush to eat it so that it would not have to be burned. Interesting, this is coming up during the week before Pesach, Passover, when all of us who are preparing for Passover at home are a little bit, stressed to get everything done that has to be done before next Friday. So one of the things is you have to get rid of the chametz. And so in this case, there could be teruma that is chametz. It's going to need to be destroyed, but because it's teruma, consecrated food, you don't want to destroy it unnecessarily. So the priest was, making sure to eat it quickly. He didn't examine it carefully. And in that circumstance, he learned that he wasn't actually qualified to eat it for some reason. They're going to, not make him liable to bring a sin offering because he was trying to perform a mitzvah and he was pressed for time. The Gemara offers a different attribution of the Mishnah. And if you wish, say a different explanation. The Mishnah is not according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who deems one liable in cases of more inclusive prohibitions and expanded prohibitions. Perhaps the Mishnah is referring only to cases of simultaneous prohibitions taking hold, and it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara asks, granted, with regard to all of the prohibitions, right? So remember, 2 brothers, betrothed 2 sisters, and then they were switched at the wedding. So each brother slept with a married woman who is his brother's wife and is his wife's sister, and they added that she was menstruating, so there were 4 prohibitions. Okay? So granted, with regard to all of the prohibitions in the Mishnah, you can find that they take effect simultaneously in the case where the men appointed a single agent to betroth the women for them, and the women appointed an agent to accept the betrothals for them, and one agent encounters the other agent. In this scenario, all the men became betrothed to all the women at the very moment that the agents meet, and the prohibitions all took effect simultaneously. There was no prohibition in place when another prohibition came into place. They all came into being at the same moment. However, with regard to the prohibition pertaining to menstruating women, how can you find the case where both women became menstruating women at the exact time of betrothal? And Rav Amram said that Rav said this is referring to a situation where the women continuously discharge menstrual blood from within the 13th year of the brothers until after they reach the age of 13 in order to deem the men liable for the prohibition pertaining to a menstruating women. In other words, the women both happened to be in the middle of their period at the time that the betrothals took effect. So everything happened at the same time. At the moment that the boys reached maturity and the betrothals went into effect, the sisters were forbidden as menstruating women, and the women were continuously discharging blood from within the 12th year of the women until after the age of 12 in order to deem the women liable for engaging relations as a menstruating woman, and the prohibition took an exact moment. That's what they're creating, that situation. And so according to Rabbi Shimon, all of the prohibitions, there's no more inclusive prohibitions being added or more expanding prohibitions being added. They're all simultaneous prohibitions coming to bear. And so even under Rabbi Shimon, we could say that they're going to each be liable to 4 sin offerings under just the theory of simultaneous prohibitions. Now, the Mishnah taught that we separate these women from their husbands for 3 months because they might have become pregnant due to the prohibited sexual relation to the man who was not her husband. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it known that a virgin woman does not become pregnant from her first sexual act? Now, we could say that, modern science and modern knowledge, would hold different. But right now, we're just going to take this at face value, that the sages had an understanding that the very first act of sex for a virgin does not impregnate. So they're just saying that, at least according to a view in the Talmud. But isn't it known that a virgin woman does not become pregnant from her first sexual act? Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avu said, this is referring to a situation where they engaged in intercourse and then repeated the act, so that it is possible that the women were impregnated during the second act of intercourse. They had sex twice in the same night. The Gemara asks, but if this is so, how can one explain that which Rabbi Chia? Here then are 16 sin offerings. If indeed each couple had sex twice that night, each sexual act would have its own set of 4 offerings from each person. So there would be a total of 32 sin offerings that this group becomes liable for. And the Gemara answers, and according to your reasoning, that Rabbi Chia's enumeration of sin offerings applies to all acts of intercourse. Well, then according to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, who deems one liable to bring a sin offering for each and every thrusting movement during a single act of intercourse. This is not the majority opinion, but Rabbi Eliezer is saying that every act of penetration, it's not just all of the penetrations which lead to one ejaculation, but rather every penetration would result in a different sin, and a different sin offering being brought. That's just Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. So each and every thrusting movement during a single act of intercourse, there would be many prohibitions that were violated, and this would greatly multiply the number of sin offerings required. Rather, it must be that Rabbi Chia, with regard to Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, is enumerating only the first thrusting movement in the intercourse, and so too with regard to the rabbi's opinion, he is enumerating only the first act of intercourse. So if there were 2 acts of intercourse, however, the number of sin offerings might be doubled, but Rabbi Chia is only commenting on the first act of intercourse. Okay? So Rava said to Rav Nachman, and now we're on 34b, but didn't Tamar become pregnant from the first act of intercourse? What? Tamar was the story of Judah, right? And his 2 sons, Er and Onan. And Tamar was married to Er, and Er died, right? Without having an heir. Er had no heir. And so Onan performed the act of Yevamos. He married his brother's a widow after his brother died childless. But Onan, famously in the Torah, didn't want to produce children with his new wife, who was the widow of his brother. Various reasons are given. The main 2 would be either he didn't want her to become pregnant and, lose her thin shape, or he didn't want to create children that would be an inconvenience to him and, his party lifestyle. He wasn't ready to have kids. He didn't want to hamper his style, as it were. He just wasn't ready to have kids. Whatever his reason was, the Lord considered it a great sin that he was spilling his seed on the ground rather than doing his brotherly obligation and impregnating his brother's widow so that he would build up his brother's house. Now, the mitzvah of Yibum had not yet been given in the world because the Torah had not yet been given in the world. Nevertheless, we're learning from the incident, and we have the oft-quoted teaching that the patriarchs sort of instinctively followed the Torah. Now, this was the children of the patriarchs, and not even the patriarchs. This is the tribes, right? Judah, the head of one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And it was his sons who were involved in this. So it may well be that Er and Onan were not following the Torah. They were sinning. And Onan died. So then you had this woman who had been married to two brothers, and both of them died. And Judah was reluctant to give her his youngest son. And, kind of stalled. And then finally Tamar, pretends to be a harlot and ends up having sex with Judah. Doesn't expose him for the crime that he committed. And, when she becomes pregnant and people say she's been playing the harlot, she had sex outside of marriage. She was supposed to be waiting for the younger son. She didn't. She became pregnant. It must be that she slept with some other man that was prohibited to her. Take her out and burn her. And Judah said, Judah came clean eventually when his staff and signet were, thrust before him privately. And he said, no, she is more righteous than I. She did the right thing. At that time, a father could perform levirate marriage. The Torah does not allow that, but this is pre-Torah. And then he married Judah. But for the purposes of our discussion here, they're suggesting that she never had sex with either Er or Onan. For whatever reason, she never had sex. She never had sexual intercourse with the first husband. He didn't do it. The second one, did something with her, but certainly spilled his seed on the ground, so maybe never penetrated her at all. And so it was her first act of sexual intercourse the night that she slept with Judah, because she was a righteous woman, and she became pregnant that night. So this would seem to contradict the teaching that a woman doesn't become pregnant the first time she has sex. So Rav Nachman said, to explain that, Tamar broke her hymen with her finger prior to intercourse, and it is due to this that she became pregnant from the first act of intercourse. As Rabbi Yitzhak said, all of those women from the household of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi who break their hymens are named Tamar by nickname. And why are they named Tamar? They are called this on account of Tamar, who broke her hymen with her finger. And the Gemara wonders about the proof from Tamar itself, but weren't there Er and Onan, her previous husbands, who presumably engaged in sexual intercourse with her? And the Gemara responds, Er and Onan engaged in sexual intercourse in an atypical manner, i.e. anal intercourse, it says here, and therefore she was still a virgin. Now the Gemara raises an objection from the Tosefta. After a woman gives birth, so they're going to have a little bit of a discussion. I think are they going to explain it? So that there this idea that women would break their hymens so that they would get pregnant the first time, or more likely to get pregnant the first time, was considered a righteous act. So that they would be always trying to perform the mitzvah not only of having pleasure with their husband, but of procreation at the same time, particularly in the case of soldiers who would go off to war and had very limited time with their wives before they had to go off to war. And so they would try to make that, that night as productive as possible. And so according to this teaching, the women who broke their own hymens first, manually, digitally, so then they were more likely to get pregnant even the first time that they had sex. So the Gemara raises an objection from the Tosefta. After a woman gives birth, her husband penetrates inside and spills his semen outside for the entire 24 months, during which the baby is breastfeeding, so that his wife does not become pregnant, as that would terminate her milk production and the child might die. This is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. They said to him, these acts are nothing other than acts similar to those of Er and Onan, which are prohibited. Regardless, it can be deduced from here that Er and Onan engaged in normative sexual intercourse with Tamar, only they did not fully complete the sexual act. They had sex with her, but then they spilled the seed outside. And the Gemara answers that Tosefta actually means that what they did was similar to the act of Er and Onan in some ways, but not similar to the act of Er and Onan in other ways. And the Gemara elaborates, it was similar to the act of Er and Onan in that there was a spilling of semen, as it is written, and it came to pass when he had intercourse with his brother's wife that he spilled it on the ground. Genesis 38:9. And yet it was not similar to the act of Er and Onan, as there, Er and Onan engaged in sexual intercourse in an atypical manner, meaning anal intercourse, while here in the Tosefta is referring to sexual intercourse in a typical manner. And the Gemara continues to clarify what took place. Granted, Onan engaged in unnatural sexual intercourse with her, as it is written with regard to his act, that he spilled it on the ground. However, from where do we derive that Er, the first brother, engaged in unnatural sexual intercourse with her? Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak said, as it is written with regard to Onan, and he slew him also. That they were being punished for the same deed that when they died. And this indicates that he too died the same death for performing the same transgression as his brother. And the Gemara asks, granted, Onan engaged in anal intercourse because he did not want Tamar to give birth, as he knew that the seed would not be his. However, with regard to Er, the first brother, what is the reason that he acted in this way? And the Gemara responds, he did so in order that she not become pregnant and become less beautiful in his eyes as a result of her pregnancy. And the sages taught, the verse states, and the woman with whom a man shall lie, giving seed, and they shall both bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the evening. Leviticus 15:18. The extra term with whom comes to exclude a bride who does not become ritually impure. And this is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. The rabbis say it excludes the case of sexual intercourse performed in an atypical manner. And Hon, the son of Rav Nachman, said to Rav Nachman, shall we say that Rabbi Yehuda holds the Torah spared a bride's adornments, including her makeup, and therefore exempted her from submersion in water, as that might cause ruin? And Rav Nachman said to him, that is not the reason. Rather, it is because a woman does not become pregnant from the first act of intercourse. Therefore, that act of intercourse would not cause ritual impurity, as it is not considered intercourse that can result in the implanting of seed. So I guess before I go on, I'll just quickly say I did a little bit of research before the class. And, an issue that comes up with this question is, the normal way of having sex is they have normal sex and the man ejaculates inside her. Is the only purpose of having sex to ejaculate inside the woman so that she has a chance of getting pregnant? Answer, no. According to our sages, there is lovemaking that is permitted even when they know that they're not going to get pregnant. It's permitted for a couple that is beyond childbearing years to have sex. They're clearly not going to produce children out of that, but is not only permitted, is obligated. Obligated, because a husband is obligated to make his wife happy. So if it's not for the purpose of creating children, does that mean that the seed needs to be, sent inside of her? According to some opinions, yes, that a man can only ejaculate inside his wife. According to other opinions, no, it doesn't have to only happen inside his wife, but it could only be that way occasionally, not a regular thing. And it should be for the purpose of creating intimacy and mutual pleasure, not to prevent her from getting pregnant for whatever reason the guy might be thinking. So if a man doesn't have the intent that Er and Onan has, according to that view, he hasn't committed a sin. According to the very stringent view that the only kind of ejaculation that's permitted is inside the wife's vagina, he would have committed that transgression. So that's as much as we're going to discuss on our show tonight, because that's not really the subject of our exploration here in Tractate Yevamos. So if this is something that you're curious about, you should speak to your rabbi or rebbitzin or somebody qualified to give answers to these questions. There's also sources available online where you can do further research. It's not a simple question. Okay. The Gemara asks, with regard to what do Rabbi Yehuda and the other rabbis disagree? The rabbis hold that the phrase giving seed excludes the initial stage of intercourse during which there is no emission of semen, meaning you could do different kinds of sex as long as it doesn't lead to ejaculation. But if it leads to ejaculation, it becomes a different action that just happened. Right. So the rabbis hold that the phrase giving seed excludes the initial stage of intercourse where there is friction but no ejaculation. And the extra phrase with whom excludes intercourse that is performed in an atypical way. So Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, holds that the exclusion of both atypical sexual intercourse and pre-ejaculatory intercourse were derived from the phrase giving seed, as neither of these are sexual acts that might bring about the birth of a seed, i.e. a child. And the phrase with whom then excludes a bride. So on the topic of intercourse that cannot result in conception, the Gemara relates the following. When Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, any woman who waits after her husband has died or divorced her for 10 years without intercourse and is then married can no longer bear children. One of those, Talmudic observations, not from, modern scientific knowledge. But he says if a woman doesn't have sex for 10 years because she doesn't have a husband, she's not having extramarital sex, and so it takes 10 years until she gets married, that at that point, she can have sex, you can have a very nice marriage, but won't be able to have children, according to this view only. Now, Rav Nachman said they taught this principle only with regard to cases where she did not intend to get married at a later time. But if she intended to get married at some point, then she can become pregnant later on, right? So it's not even what you thought it was, right? So, she can wait 10 years as long as she's thinking at some point I want to get married and have children. If she sort of gives up on that, then that will affect whether she remains fertile or not. Rava said to his wife, the daughter of Rav Chisda, the sages are gossiping about you. From the time that she was widowed from her first husband until the time that she was married to Rava, more than 10 years passed, and yet she bore him children. It seemed as though she had engaged in intercourse in the meantime, because she must not have gone 10 years without sex if she finally got pregnant, right? But it would be explained if it's also true that she was intending to have children eventually, then she wouldn't have been rendered infertile by all that time off. She said to him, my mind was on you. Indeed, it is told that already as a young girl, she prophesied that she would marry Rava. And the Gemara relates a certain woman who came before Rav Yosef said to him, my teacher, I'm almost done, so if you have any questions or comments, get them in. A certain woman came before Rav Yosef and said to him, my teacher, I waited after my husband's death for 10 years, and nevertheless I gave birth. He said to her, my daughter, do not cast aspersions on the statement of the sages. Something was not kosher about what you're telling me. She said to him in confession, well, you're right. I had sexual intercourse with a Gentile during those 10 years. So it's not that she was without sex during those 10 years that she was waiting. She was having sex, just not with a Jew. Okay, that concludes our study of page 34 here in Tractate Yevamos. Let's see if there are any questions or comments on this material. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shach, okay, Nina is telling me that there's a discussion about the kares penalty, so death at the hands of the heavenly court. Interesting, Tom says, interesting that eating on Yom Kippur doesn't incur kares. Well, I think eating on Yom Kippur would incur kares if you did it unwittingly. Right, because in that, it's interesting, like in the case that we were talking about, did the person intend to eat and they just were eating the wrong thing? Which if they did it on Yom Kippur, it was intentional act of eating. And I think maybe that's why it was a guilt offering and not a sin offering. If they didn't intend to actually put something in their mouth when it was Yom Kippur, or if they didn't know it was Yom Kippur, then I think it would be a kares-bearing penalty, but I'm not sure. Sharon, I heard a teaching related to last Shabbat's Torah portion that charis offerings are not necessarily sin offerings, but rather a purification offering, which changes the implications of these offerings in these circumstances. Very interesting. So what Sharon is alluding to is, for example, somebody who was a Nazir, right, who took a vow not to benefit from the grapevine, either by drinking wine or eating grapes or anything, and not to cut his hair during the days of his Naziris. So when he finishes, when the days of that vow end, he doesn't sort of re-enter society in the normal way again until he brings certain offerings, some of which are sin offerings. Likewise, one who had tzara'as, right? They go through the purification period and then they must bring offerings, and among those offerings are sin offerings. Now you could say, well, the Mitzorah, the one who had tzara'as, was being punished, probably for lashon hara, for evil tongue, gossip, and it might make sense that part of his purification is to bring a sin offering. The Nazir, he took a vow to try to be more pious and take upon himself not to drink any wine or cut his hair. Why would he have to bring a sin offering as part of his purification? And we've heard the sages talk about that and say, well, he shouldn't have taken that vow. Everything that is permitted to us is permitted by Torah law. Why should you take on an additional stringency in your life and take a vow not to benefit of something that God gave you, that rendered permitted for you? And so there's a sort of aspect of a sin offering about that. But nevertheless, Sharon's point is really good, that sometimes sin offerings are part of purification. And so because sometimes sin offerings are part of purification, that purification aspect of sin offerings is part of teshuvah, of doing atonement. Even today, when we don't have a temple and we can't bring sin offerings to help us get out of the sins that we inadvertently committed, we still have a teshuvah process, an atonement process, like offering, whether something is intentional or not. Sometimes that's a gray line, right? When we speak, malicious, like in a fight, and we say things we regret, we spoke on purpose. We were in the midst of, emotion, and we probably regret it. And then we apologize, perhaps to our spouse for the way that we treated them when we were, in the midst of that heavy emotion. But, sort of part of that, so part of that atonement process that follows some kind of transgression is making amends. But there's also, I think what Sharon is getting at, there's a kind of internal purification that is part of the atonement process. That is both, I think, it's both cause and effect, right? That I need to purify myself so I won't commit that sin again. And going through an atonement helps me get out that residue of the sin, so I become a new person who's less likely to commit that sin again. It's beautiful that purification is part of atonement. Sharon also says, how can they say that a woman cannot become pregnant on the first time when the traditional Jewish practice is at a time when it is highly likely that a woman can become pregnant? But also, it's like, they didn't know exactly when they became pregnant. That's why they're saying 3 months. You have to take time off. Did they become pregnant that night? Did they have sex? If they have sex twice the same night, that second time, it does not come under this teaching. You're as likely to become pregnant the second time you have sex as any other time the rest of your life. They're just saying the first time. And I think maybe that's not so... we shouldn't be quick to laugh at that as moderns. Because if you think back, if you're, let's say, a married person who's had sex sometime in your life, if you think back to the very first time you had sex in your life, very often awkward, difficult. And maybe this teaching is meant to say to people, don't feel bad if everything went really bad and it seemed unsatisfying and you're not even sure if you did it or not, and it was painful or uncomfortable, or, like young people don't know until they gather more experience, and maybe this teaching makes it a little bit easier for them. Okay, very interesting. So Yosef Shum is commenting a little bit on what we learned tonight about, which kinds of sex are permitted or not and why. And he says, I have heard the teaching that when a couple are intimate, it is important to keep a pure mind, even with your spouse, or there can be spiritual consequences for the children that result from the act. Is this a Talmudic teaching or from the Bible? Are you aware of where this idea might have originated? Actually, I did a little reading about this when I was looking up a little bit of the law on this before the class. And even in the Talmud, I think it's in Tractate Nedarim, I want to say. But I'm not sure. Maybe it was Gittin. I'm not sure. But it said somewhere that, first of all, certain sexual practices, might lead to like complications and deformities of the children. One rabbi said that, and the other rabbi said, no, we disagree. Right? So it was one view, and it was a minority view, and it was overridden by the other views. That's about sort of like alternative acts. This idea of keeping a pure mind, there's like only so far that you can go with that, right? It's like somebody says to you, don't think about a white elephant. It's going to be hard to keep that thought out of your mind, right? So there's only so much control that we have. We're human. And this idea that it would be better, when engaging in this incredibly holy act of partnering with God to create, a new human being, it would be better if you entered that with a holy intention, right? But it's also true that forging intimacy over time, over the many years between husbands and wives, it's not always about having children. And sometimes they just, need to do what they do to bring the couple closer. And that in itself is very holy. So you are going to find certain people who are, pretty extreme and saying you got to have pure act, pure mind, pure this, pure that. But it doesn't rise to the level of halacha. It's not a law. Specifically. Now, there's more specific answers to more specific questions than the one we're discussing here. And as I said before, if you're really interested in this subject, it needs further research. It needs a qualified, competent, Orthodox rabbi to talk to. And then you can get deeper answers. It's just beyond the scope of what we're learning tonight. So all I'm going to say, the answer to your question is, Yosef, it depends. For the more specifics are required to reach more specific answers. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. Recall, no class tomorrow. There's no class tomorrow, Monday night. I have a conflict. There will be class on Tuesday, God willing. Then I'm actually telling you right now, they're going to have a conflict on Wednesday because our family's coming to town. We're preparing for Pesach. Seder is Friday night. So we're going to have a class Thursday. That's the plan. This coming week, we'll have class on Tuesday and on Thursday, but not on Monday or Wednesday. And then Friday's already Passover. No class that day. So no class Friday, no class Saturday, and I'm pretty sure no class Sunday. And then we'll resume Chol HaMoed, right, in the intermediate days of Passover on Monday. So this week, there's only going to be class Tuesday and Thursday. And I'll publish that schedule on the page and in the Facebook group. But this week, there's only going to be class Tuesday and Thursday, right? So we'll be doing probably doubles on Tuesday and Thursday. And then we'll take 3 days off for the first days of Passover. I think I clarified that. Nina's passing me a note, but I think I've clarified it, right? Class Tuesday and Thursday, no class Friday right before Passover. Because Passover starts Friday night. Did I say something different? Passover starts Friday night. The first Seder is Friday night. First Seder is Friday night. Passover starts Friday night. But that Friday afternoon, when I would normally have class Friday at noon, as we know, the final preparations for Passover, like we read in Pesachim, really, turns a corner. It's an important moment, noon on Friday. And there's going to be so much to do that day, so there's not going to be class. So this week, class on Tuesday and Thursday. Passover begins Friday night. Have a great night. See you Tuesday.